We'll call to order the third meeting of the Interim Joint Committee on Appropriations and Revenue, Wednesday, August the 2nd, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We are in Annex Room 149, and if you will, please call the roll.
Senator Boswell, Senator Deneen, Senator Douglas, Representative Brown, Representative Dossett,
Present.
Representative Flannery,
Here.
Representative Fleming, Representative Freeland,
Present.
Representative Fugit,
Here.
Representative Gentry,
Here.
Representative Hart,
Here.
Representative Johnson,
Here.
Representative McCool,
Here.
Representative McPherson,
Here.
Representative Palumbo, here, Representative Raymond,
Present.
of Upchurch, Chair Petrie.
Here. We have a quorum, and we entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the July 19 meeting. I have a motion and a second. All in favor? All opposed? Minutes are approved. And needs a Kentucky Sky Rural Water Association. Come on up to the table if you will. We may move the agenda around a little bit. Do I see Ryan Barrow back there? Yep. John Hicks. Sorry, I didn't see y'all earlier. We may take you up right after we get finished with water so y'all can move on if you don't mind. We'll go ahead and do the water and just advise everybody, most of you had equipment issues. So anyone who has a wired mic may be on for a bit and then they're off for a bit and on for a bit, no rhyme or reason to it. At the table, I'm hoping that they have a wireless microphone for you, handheld. That is probably what you will need. The reason we're doing that is trying to preserve the record. Someone else comes back to listen to this for minutes, as well as the public trying to look at it later on. That microphone will keep a record, whereas the rest of them are iffy at best for today's purposes. If you're somebody using a wired mic up here, just realize you may go off. Speak loudly to make sure it's being caught as best we can in the room, and the record will be whatever it's going to be. With that said, Scott Young, Executive Director, if you will introduce yourself for the record, please. Make sure the microphone's working.
Thank you, Chairman Petrie and members of the committee. My name is Scott Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Rural Water Association. And for full disclosure, I've been on the job 1 year, 1 month, and 2 days. And with that, if you allow me a little leeway, I'll lead into and recognize a few of my colleagues that are in the room.
Sure.
Our Kentucky Rural Water Association's president, Mr. Russ Rose, is joining us today. Russ is the Chief Executive Officer of Oldham County Water District. We also have Miss Savannah Go. Savannah is the Marketing and Business Development Coordinator for Kentucky Rural Water. And my longtime friend and colleague and previous Executive Director, Mr. Gary Larimore. So have some extremely large shoes to fill, but Gary's always there. So
Very good. Thank y'all all for being here. If you will, raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. If you will, please proceed. Water needs in Kentucky.
Yes, sir. And I'm going to try to be very efficient in my presentation. I do have a lot of information that I want to provide. I think it's great information, and I'll try to be respectful of your time as well. So just bear with me, and if that leads into any additional explanation or questions, I warrant those. So first, let's explore Kentucky's water systems and look at Kentucky water infrastructure. There's 432 public water systems in Kentucky, and I think it's important to note that Kentucky Rural Water Association, through its membership, represents 95% of the water and wastewater utilities in Kentucky. Kentucky has 213 water treatment plants, and one thing that's interesting about that is those plants have an average age on that infrastructure of approximately 38 years. Kentucky also has around 64,000 miles of water mains, and another aspect of that is that the average age of that infrastructure is approaching 40 years, and 20% of that infrastructure is already over 50 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And one of the recent U.S. EPA estimations is that Kentucky has roughly about 40,000 lead service lines within Kentucky that need to be replaced. One of the things that I'll kind of get into is when we look at water in Kentucky and we evaluate the history of water and where we've been and where we are today and where we're going, and I hope that's what we do as we go through this presentation, identify where we need to go. It's important to make note of a few things. In 2019, the American Society of Civil Engineers published their infrastructure report card. Most people are familiar with that. And it rated Kentucky's drinking water system as a C+, and it rated Kentucky's wastewater infrastructure as a C-, about middle of the road. There's a lot of room for improvement there. But one item that's interesting to note that there was recently, and by recent I mean just about a week or two ago, a J.D. Power report that was published that ranked Kentucky #1 in the nation for its drinking water. And that's out of all 50 states. And the thing to keep in mind with this study is that study evaluated quality, reliability, cost, etc., but it also focused only on large utilities across the country. So there is that need for a smaller utility infrastructure, and we'll talk about that as well. Another area that Kentucky has done exceptionally well in, and when you look at this map that's on the screen, is the availability of public water systems. 95% of Kentuckians have access to clean, safe drinking water. And another area that's often overlooked is the efforts of regionalization. And so over the last 49 years, Kentucky has seen an 80% decline in the number of public water systems, and that's huge. And Kentucky actually leads the country in our regionalization and consolidation efforts. So today I want to focus on basically 4 top challenges that Kentucky Water's systems infrastructure face. And one thing to make note of, the information that I'm giving you is geared toward, I'm going to say, water. But as we go through this presentation, please keep in mind that everything that we're going to talk about today, whether a challenge or a need, is identical both on the water side and the wastewater side. So I want to look at aging infrastructure first, and this is where I'm going to get down in the weeds just a little bit and give a lot of detail, but I think it's very warranted. One of the major talking points regarding challenges facing water systems revolves around the implications of aging infrastructure and the necessary steps to address them. And here's some key takeaways or key points. Deterioration of infrastructure. Many water systems were constructed decades ago. The components of these older aging systems, such as pipelines, treatment plants, pump stations, and storage facilities, have reached or exceeded their expected useful life. And as a result, these structures are more prone to leaks, interruptions in service, and inefficiencies, leading to higher operating costs and lower operating capacities. Aging infrastructure can also contribute to significant impacts on water quality issues. Leaky pipes and outdated treatment methods affect water quality and increase potential contamination and public health risks. Reliability and service interruptions. Aging infrastructure is more often prone to failures and service interruptions. These disruptions can particularly be challenging in rural areas that are prone to natural disasters or where backup systems and operational redundancies are not readily available. Financial constraints and economic impact. The cost of maintaining, repairing, and replacing aging infrastructure are substantial and require asset management and planning. And quite often, smaller communities struggle to provide secure funding, which typically leads to deficient system capacity, deferred maintenance, and an increased backlog in repairs. Regulatory compliance, we're gonna dive deep into this in just a second. I'm gonna skip over that in the essence of time. But aging infrastructure can also be a deterrent to economic growth. This is typically due to a lack of capacity, reliability, and redundancy of older infrastructure. So in April of this year, US EPA published the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, and what this survey revealed is that over the next 20 years, Kentucky needs $7.8 billion of infrastructure investments in its water systems. When you evaluate the wastewater side, that report is currently being finalized by US EPA, but the last report that we had was published in 2012, and it put that mark at $6.2 billion. So we know that it's going to be substantially higher than that. So that's the need. And when you look at the $7.8 billion over 20 years, that's roughly $392 million per year. So that shows the impending need that is there. And one thing that, as we go through this presentation, I'm going to identify the needs on each slide. But what I'd like to do is wait till the end of this presentation and address all these needs concurrently, because what you're going to see is that these needs coincide with one another independently. Regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance is a significant challenge facing Kentucky's water systems. One major issue with regulatory compliance is the complexity of some regulations. Understanding and navigating the ever-changing regulatory landscape can often be overwhelming for utilities that do not have the technical expertise to manage, monitor, and ensure regulatory compliance. And one of the most significant impacts of regulatory compliance is emerging contaminants and new regulations. And as a former utility manager, I could spend the next hour just talking about this topic. I guess the main takeaway is that this is going to be extremely costly, labor intensive, and necessitate a specialized technical skill set for utilities in the future. This also leads into inadequate treatment methods and technologies. As new contaminants emerge, laboratory testing capabilities improve, and as new regulations are promulgated, significant upgrades to treatment processes and utility infrastructure will be required for our systems to meet those regulatory compliance obligations. And overall, the future of regulatory compliance for water utilities will demand significant investments in infrastructure and a professional workforce with diverse technical expertise across various disciplines. If we evaluate funding and financial constraints, that's another significant challenge water systems face. These commonly include utility financial sustainability, the inability to qualify for various funding opportunities, and the lack of funding for non-capital cost. When we look at a utility's financial sustainability, we typically start with rates, and many utilities have insufficient rates that limit operating and maintenance cost recovery and that don't support new capital projects. Another issue that utilities and local elected officials are often utilities and local elected officials are often hesitant to raise rates due to concerns about affordability and pushback from ratepayers. Another area of focus is the opportunity for regionalization and consolidation. And I know I'm skipping some of these, and I think some of them are self-explanatory, and we can come back to those if need be. But some utilities carry substantial debt and liabilities that often discourage regionalization efforts. And for utilities considering taking over another system, there's typically a significant expense involved when allocating financial resources and technical assistance to bring deficient systems into operating and regulatory compliance. It's also important to note that some utilities often lack the basic financial capacity to even qualify for the funding opportunities that are out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And I'm going to glaze over non-capital funding opportunities for now, other than saying historically the primary focus for all water systems has been directed toward capital brick and mortar projects, and we're going to come back and identify some of those needs as we move forward. Technical expertise and workforce. That basically can be summed up more specifically as limited availability of qualified personnel, lack of utility succession planning, and lack of effective recruitment strategies within the water industry. And we can best reinforce this topic with a few statistics and I'm going to go to that slide, from the 2022 Kentucky Water Workforce Survey that was conducted by the University of Kentucky's Water Resource Research Institute. I've listed a lot of this information and it's within your packet, and I'm not going to touch on each of these individually, but this is just a pulling out a few highlights from this report. I placed a link in this presentation to the full report, and it has some great information that revolves around our industry. But I do want to touch on just a few things. 56% of utilities do not have enough certified water operators, and 65% do not have enough certified wastewater operators. And the big takeaway from that is half of the water and wastewater utilities in Kentucky currently do not have enough certified operators to meet the daily operational needs that exist today. 30% of operators and 40% of utility managers plan to retire within the next 6 years. And we already have a workforce shortfall, and this problem will be further compounded by future attrition. And I think it's important to note that 20% of the survey respondents were less than 35 years old, and only 2% were less than 25 years old. And this data underscores the necessity of implementing strategies and recruitments aimed at appealing to a younger generation of workers. So let's talk about Kentucky water utility needs. How do these challenges impact the needs of Kentucky's utilities? Infrastructure investment is pretty straightforward. However, although we have witnessed unprecedented infrastructure funding opportunities, the identified project needs for Kentucky water utilities significantly surpasses the conventional funding options that are available. And in spite of the news, industry publications, and other areas that highlight the record funding opportunities available, a funding gap remains for water systems that lack the managerial and financial capacity to access these opportunities. And quite often, rural systems just have a lack of knowledge and information about the funding of opportunities that are available. Another form of needed utility infrastructure investment is technological upgrades. By incorporating advanced technologies and modern water treatment methods, utilities can improve system efficiency, resiliency, and water quality while reducing operating costs and help lower the needed workforce demand. Technical assistance represents another essential need with multiple facets that are directly interconnected with other utility strategies that we've identified. Small water systems often need very specific technical assistance as it relates to utility operations, treatment, finance, regulatory compliance, and workforce development. We could spend another hour specifically talking about technical needs of our utilities, but what I want to do is briefly give you a great example of needed technical assistance as it relates to geographic information systems, or GIS, and Kentucky Rural Water's efforts to meet these needs for smaller utility systems. The use of GIS allows utility, and I'm just using this as one technical example. The use of GIS allows utilities to have an inventory and working map of their distribution system, but it also establishes the framework for developing a utility asset management plan and subsequent capital improvement plans. We found out during the Western Kentucky tornado events in 2021 and the Eastern Kentucky flooding events in 2022 that GIS was a vital and essential component of the utility's emergency response and system restoration efforts. And a big part of our GIS initiative for small systems is directly attributed to the exceptional working relationship that Rural Water has with the Kentucky Division of Water and the Department for Local Government and the respective funding agencies of EPA and ARC. We have other numerous initiatives underway to assist water systems, but this is a good boots-on-the-ground example of collaborative strategic partnerships that target multiple funding opportunities to maximize a common solution for utilities across the Commonwealth. Another need is asset management and planning. Comprehensive asset management plans place emphasis on the infrastructure needs and pinpoint critical assets. This data can then serve as a framework for both short and long-term planning, identifying maintenance, rehabilitation, and new capital infrastructure projects. These tools enable utilities to preempt costly emergency repairs and prioritize the efficient allocation of available funding. Regional cooperation and consolidation. When it comes to regionalization, the two most common approaches are a cooperative utility management agreement and utility consolidation. While some utility systems want to consolidate and merge their operations, pool resources, and potentially increase their customer base in an effort to improve financial sustainability, other systems prefer to retain their community leadership and boards and elect to allow the day-to-day management operations to be handled by another well-run system or a private utility company. As we discussed earlier, the current financial sustainability of certain utilities often hinders the regionalization approach. Additional funding opportunities are needed to encourage regionalization, as well as innovative regulatory strategies that will facilitate the regionalization process. Workforce development. When we think of workforce development within the water industry, we often think of recruiting and retention tools similar to other industries. These are needed strategies. However, there is a much greater need for programs that improve utility management and leadership, programs that assist utility personnel in the operator certification pathway, and needed efforts to expand our water and wastewater apprenticeship program. While significant financial investments have been made in water infrastructure projects, there's a concurrent need for investments in the essential workforce responsible for the operation and maintenance of our infrastructure, and likewise, a need to classify the water and wastewater sector as an essential occupation in Kentucky. And lastly, non-capital utility investments. To expand upon some of the earlier talking points, non-capital funding opportunities would play a vital role in closing the financial gap for some utilities by enabling them to improve their financial viability and operational resiliency. And likewise, this approach could be used in various capacities to facilitate regionalization opportunities. And in the 2022 General Assembly, a Water Management Assistance Fund was created to support both capital and non-capital funding needs for governmental water and wastewater utilities. And currently, Kentucky Rural Water is assisting the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority in developing funding criteria for assistance in this fund. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank this committee and acknowledge the legislative efforts in creating this essential resource that will be a great asset to Kentucky's water utilities. So in conclusion, the state of Kentucky is poised to capitalize on its water and wastewater capabilities. As we look to the future, there are a few questions that come to mind, and these are just my questions as I ponder. There's no agenda, there's no ask. These are just things that we are focusing on for the future of our industry, and they revolve around what strategies can we employ to address these challenges proactively? How can we improve upon past approaches in meeting the needs of our water utilities? And how do we tackle these needs before they become emergencies? And with that, I'll finally stop and answer any questions that you might have.
Very good, thank you. Very quickly, before we move on to a particular question, Rural Water speaks on behalf of or addresses, in particular, how many districts across the Commonwealth by percentage or by numbers. So when we're talking to Rural Water, we talking to 10% of the districts, 90% of the districts?
I don't know specifically the district makeup, but our membership does involve over 360 individual utility members.
Very good. Geography-wise, half the state, three-quarters of the state?
That's all across the Commonwealth.
Okay. All right, gotcha. And just to cover the base, is there any other association in talking about water needs in Kentucky that we should have brought on today or bring on another time?
There is the Kentucky Municipal Utility Authority. That looks at municipal utility water and wastewater systems.
Okay. Very good. Representative McCool, had a question or comment?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on a double barrel here, so hopefully what I'm working at some point in time. First of all, Mr. Young, thank you for your presentation today. It's so much needed for people to understand and be aware of what's going on in Kentucky. As you probably know, I represent an area that's in dire need, and that being Martin County. And that's the Martin County is just a sample of what could be anywhere in Kentucky if we're not looking at this very deeply and very hard and trying to address this issue. So I want to thank you for that. I don't know why you chose to take on this charge, but I certainly appreciate you doing that. On the comment, the question that I've got, and you brought up about the your lack of certified, qualified employment. I would hope that KCTC, this is a workforce need. And I would hope that with this new president coming in, KCTCS or something would really jump on this, because as I understand it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you said there's 432 public water systems in Kentucky. Probably all of them have different boards. Really don't have a good pool of qualified people to pull from. And it's not just in Kentucky. So if somebody were to get these credentials, they're not limited to just Kentucky. This is a great workforce opportunity for people to gain skills and become gainfully employed very well. My question is, do you think we should have more of a hold on that? Because you got these individual systems or what? Hey, maybe you hired someone like me and I couldn't, and there's a lot of chemistry involved in this, a lot of math involved in this. If you don't have that skill set, then you take a real risk. I like your apprenticeship program. I think that's a great opportunity, but at the same time, how can we help with that as legislative point of view? How can we help to make sure that we got a pool of people to pull from? Right now we're so far behind, it would take a long time to get a pool there. But it seems to me we got the cart before the horse. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. And thank you, Representative McCool. You bring up some very great points. The way that our apprenticeship program is structured, with it being a federal Department of Labor program, there's certain specifications as it revolves as on-the-job training, and I won't get into all those criteria. I can, but there's a program associated, and you're exactly right. That is more of once that apprentice is hired and already working at the utility, we start him down that pathway to become a certified operator through that apprenticeship program. And you identified a need. There's so many workforce needs. There's so many technical needs associated with just our industry. And we do need to figure out alternate methods to get people in that pipeline and explore that. The problem is there's often reluctance on the utilities part to either make an investment in an individual, thinking that they may come. You bring up also a good point that once they get to that certified operator status, and there's different levels of being certified, they can take that with them. And one of the things that, and I didn't point this out, but one of the things in that report, and it's listed on that statistics, is that I think it was 70% of the utilities have lost workforce, and they've lost them to other bigger utilities. So they tend to migrate where there's better pay, better benefits, better opportunity for advancement, those types of things. And so that the problem is so complex and compounds upon itself that it isn't just a workforce problem. We got to figure out pay. We got to figure out benefits. We got to figure out advancement opportunities. We got to figure out everything that revolves around the water and the wastewater sector. And basically, to answer that question is we've got to figure out how to acknowledge and create the vision for that workforce sector so that it's recognized as a professional occupation within Kentucky.
Very good.
Thank you.
Alluded to it, or program you are using a registered apprenticeship that's national.
Yes, sir.
And is the state helping you with that on setting up, bringing you people? Because I think if the operators know that most of the time you talk about them getting their credentials and then transitioning away, most of the time if you spend the time and money into an apprentice, they stay with you. They don't move, except for the program at Bell County, because in Bell County that's a low. It's a prison, so they have an apprenticeship program. They do want to leave there, so thank you.
And that's a great point, because the pathway is limited right now, and we do coordinate with the state on helping in acquiring what facilitation assistance we can get from them. I think one of the big needs that we see is we got to figure out how to get, before they even get to the utility level, we got to figure out how to get them in that pathway, get them in that conduit, get them in that pipeline to get them interested in our industry. But we also need some type of, and when I talk about non-conventional funding mechanisms or non-capital, one of the big reluctancies that we see, especially with smaller utilities, is that they either don't have the budget to make that investment in that new employee that they hope is going to make a certified operator, or they often don't have the investment to make in somebody just to bring on with the intent that they're going to put them in that apprenticeship program. So there's opportunity to help with minimum tuition cost associated with the apprenticeship program. It's a very cost-effective program. And when I say tuition, we're not charging people to participate. We're just covering the material that's needed and the courses that are needed for them to meet those federal guidelines. But there's a lot of opportunity for us to expand upon those capacities in that pathway. And if we could ever figure out some type of mechanism, I don't want to use the word subsidize, but that would encourage utilities to participate and assist them through that process, I think we can really gain a lot of additional traction.
That's where the state used to and should be able to help you with that.
Very good. Representative Stevenson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You may have said this and I didn't exactly catch it, so I just want to clarify the 20-year infrastructure investment that you're talking about at $7.8 billion. Is that for our existing infrastructure, or does that encompass?
That is looking primarily at the existing infrastructure that we have, and how do we replace the aging components of that? How do we improve the treatment capacities of that to comply with the regulatory requirements that are coming? And there will be things that, from a capacity development standpoint, that's included in that, but that's not going to include upgrading a water treatment plant for a possible, end user factory that's going to use 1 million gallons per day. It's not taking in those things. That's just looking at the condition of our existing infrastructure.
That's exactly what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Chair, and thank you, Scott, for coming in and giving that presentation. Not only in the rural water area, but in all types of areas of not only Kentucky, across the nation. But there's something in particular you said in your presentation that stood out to me, and I wanted to ask if you could expand on that a little bit more. And pardon me if I wrote this down, pardon me if I didn't get every word correct, but it said something like rural water utilities often lack resources to identify funding opportunities that may be available. Is this more related to federal grant opportunities with recent legislation, infrastructure, Inflation Reduction Act, those sorts of things, or is it other types of funding, or what is meant when you make a statement? That's a very alarming statement to me, and anything we could do at all to improve that situation, I think everybody needs to know that. So.
Yes, sir. That's a great question, Representative Gentry. And I guess coming from the large utility world that I came from, where you had so many resources, people, you had, we could just handle these types of things. So the biggest, and I say this story all the time to my colleagues, but the biggest eye-opening experience for me, coming from that utility world into the rural water setting, is just understanding the daily capacity that some of these smaller systems have. You may have a water district that only has 4 employees. And sometimes they may lack the managerial or financial capacity to even apply for some of these funding opportunities. So when I talk about technical assistance, it's not just the assistance in operating the day-to-day distribution system or water treatment plant. It's the technical assistance needed in developing a budget, capital improvement plans, assisting with the process of audits. There's several utilities that miss out, especially through the state revolving loan fund process, because they haven't had an audit in 2 or 3 years. And so there's a need there just to assist some of these systems from that capacity standpoint of internal, those soft costs, to get them where they're ready to go after some of these funding opportunities. Does that make sense?
Very good. Good question. Senator Webb?
I've served on a lot of water task forces through the years, and I think your numbers are conservative as to need and notwithstanding potential growth, but also the PFAs and how we factor in until the feds, anticipated federal regulation, and then with whatever Kentucky's going to do with that, coupled with potential litigation and costs and mandates. Back in my head, I'm thinking, stormwater all years and timelines and mandates from the feds. I don't think that's been factored into the projections, have they?
No, ma'am.
And you anticipate all of those factors from a fiscal standpoint?
The thing that's most concerning coming from that utility world, when I look at these emerging contaminants, and when you bring up PFAS and PFOA, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, I had the pleasure of serving on National Rural Waters Legislative Committee, where we made comments on that federal registry and those proposed regs. The level of complexity of what's in there and what's coming and the limits that they have proposed. It's not a law yet. It's still being promulgated. But as a former utility manager, emerging contaminants concern me to the level of aging infrastructure. The need for number one, the end cost that's going to go to the ratepayers to comply with the emerging contaminants, it's going to be tremendous. But it's not just an issue that's going to impact Kentucky. That's going to be a nationwide issue. And there's so many other things, so it factors into that. And yes, the U.S. EPA projections is not accounting for any type of new law that hadn't been developed yet. It's just looking at the current status of our water systems and what laws are on the book. So that's very concerning to me.
Well, I appreciate it, and if you I know you'll keep us updated, because I feel like it's worthy to note it's going to cost a lot of money in the next few years. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Thank y'all. Thank you for your presentation, but I do want to focus on one thing that you had said toward the end. We can improve on past practices or past approaches. And I know we have programs involved for low interest loans and those type things. Emergency. We need a $20 million program. We need a $30 million assist. We need an improvement on past practices rather than how do we better address emergencies after they occur, and start trying to plan 5, 15, 50 years out as best we can to avoid as many of those as possible.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Number 6, Kentucky Reserves. John Hicks, Ryan Barrow. And of course, I'm not even saying that.
Thank you very much. See if these work.
First off, I don't know if y'all were in the room when we very first started, that wireless microphone is what you'll want to use to talk. There is a system problem in the annex right now, and so that's going to cut out if you use a wired mic. For the record, let's keep that. If each of you will introduce yourselves for the records, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Hicks, State Budget Director, Secretary of the Governor's Executive Cabinet.
Ryan Barrow, Office of Financial Management.
And will each of you raise your right hands? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much, and please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here, we're going to talk today about Kentucky's reserve, and I'm going to give you a little background, a little overview of the reserves and recent history. And when I'm talking about the reserves today, I'm talking about the General Fund's Budget Reserve Trust Fund, commonly sometimes called as a rainy day fund. Statutorily, that's the name of our fund, the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. The Budget Reserve Trust Fund actually was enacted during Governor Jones' administration in the General Assembly. We started one in the early 90s, and then around mid-90s, the General Assembly passed a statute to create the actual trust fund. It's part of KRS 48705. It's part of the general fund. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about recent, phenomenal history of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. I've got about a 25-year bar chart. About a 25-year bar chart here that shows the bar level is the end, if you will, the end of the year balance of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund, and then down below you see a percentage, which is measured as the trust fund's balance as divided by general fund revenues for that year. All right, so you can see that the last 3 years have been, last 4 years actually, but last 3 years have been something unlike we've seen actually since the inception of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund in the mid-90s. We are now up to over $3.7 billion. At the end of fiscal 23, we deposited $1.45 billion from the fiscal 23 surplus in the general fund to the Budget Reserve Trust Fund, bringing it up to that balance, so almost a quarter of our general fund revenues. The National Association of State Budget Officers in June released a report with estimates of all 50 states of the balance of their Budget Reserve Trust Funds, equivalent reserve funds. Kentucky, based upon that, we would rank 6th highest. 4 years ago, we'd have been 4th lowest. And 5 of those 6 states are oil states, which typically have very high reserves because of the volatility of that revenue stream in Alaska and New Mexico and North Dakota, states like that. So, really a unique circumstance. Next slide. I also want to talk about the uses of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. This is just a bar chart that showed the value of the uses since fiscal 2000. And you can see the last time we used the Budget Reserve Trust Fund to accommodate or partially a revenue shortfall was fiscal 2009, where we used $219 million. You see that's about in the middle of the chart, which was an outlier, you can see, from some of the other years. And then you move over into the last 2 years that we just finished. 2 events were significant here. In fiscal 22, the 2021 special session that dealt with economic development incentives, one of which resulted in a pretty major 2 EV battery plant in Hardin County. That was an appropriation. That was a use of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund of $410.6 million. That was the bulk of that bar chart. And then this past year, fiscal 23, we had $485 million in uses. The majority of that's related to the Eastern Kentucky flooding disaster. In the special session of 2022, you appropriated $200 million for the East Kentucky Safe Fund. And then we had over $266 million in what we refer to as necessary government expenses through the Department of Military Affairs Division of Emergency Management. Those are the expenses to respond to the flooding disaster. And it's still ongoing. And so we were so fortunate in those 2 instances to have a large Budget Reserve Trust Fund to be able to accommodate a great economic development opportunity, and secondly, the response to one of the most significant disasters we've ever incurred. So just using that as a lesson of the good use of Budget Reserve Trust Funds. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Ryan Barrow and talk a little bit about the investment of reserves and some of the underlying principles and techniques that he uses.
Sure. Thank you, Secretary. It's a pleasure to be here today. Always interested to talk about investments. Usually I get the debt opportunity, but it all starts in statute 42500. That really sets up the State Investment Commission. That is the oversight of all investments. That entity, as I said, is really 42500, sets it all up. It outlays our investment objectives. What are our goals in investments? It mandates funds in excess of current cash. So current cash is at JP Morgan, that pays the bills. That's money in and out. This is outside of our checking account, and it is invested in permissible investments as defined by that statute. And then there's kind of a general default on how interest is posted within the Commonwealth. Below that, we have a series of regulations. I won't bore you with those details, but that really gets us past all the structural policy issues down into the implementation, which our office is in charge of. That's spelled out and summarized in our investment manual that's available, and it adds some additional things that SIC takes in terms of trading limits, how much we have a portfolio manager here today, how much she can or cannot invest, as well as the rest of her team. trade execution, et cetera. And I do note, although it's been some time, we did have an external consultant come in 2012, PFM, nationally renowned consultant in investment space, kind of validated that, gave us some things to implement. I actually started just after that PFM report, so was able to work on some of those implementations. So the investment objectives, kind of where we start. It is kind of a fiduciary responsibility. You know your customer, and our customers are basically 3,000 plus accounts across the Commonwealth. We do have kind of a three-tiered approach. It's different than maybe the retirement savings that you have out there. Our first is preservation of principal. That is key. It's led, those that did not focus on that led to the 3 bank failures recently we've all read about in the press. More focused on the state. No one in our position is able to go out and buy a long-term security or a high-risk asset and have the General Assembly appropriate money and us to say, well, if we have to liquidate that security, it's going to be taken at a loss. We don't have that ability. Second is liquidity. So behind preserving the states and citizens' cash is that liquidity. We have to be able to pay the bills. So we have to get money kind of from investments to and from our checking account to ensure there's adequate money. And we can't anticipate everything, and obviously the budget bill dictates quite a bit of movement of money that we cannot anticipate, so we have to ensure that those bills are paid. Third, and behind those two, is maximization of return. Secretary talked about the general fund reserves, and the budget office and the controller's office function more at the account level. Our office functions above that at what we call the pool level. So those reserves are in kind of the short-term pool, and that's really just general fund money and related money. But the vast majority of it is the budget reserve trust fund. We have a longer duration pool, the intermediate, and we have kind of a money market equivalent that we run right now. There's been several others in my tenure here. We've had Trans and the Louisville Bridge pool that I was able to work on. We invested that separately. And me working at OFM, there was a UK hospital and there was tobacco investments. So this chart is a little bit, but I think it does a really good job of the point we're trying to articulate in terms of cash balances. So if I could draw your attention to the bottom, the line, that is where the state had functioned historically. Kim's been here 20 plus years, our portfolio manager. She's seen, basically negative cash balances in the general fund. So we talk about kind of a status point of the budget reserve trust fund, but we allocate and the state spends money faster than we collect it. So we run a negative cash balance throughout the year. Historically, this says 2017 through 2019, but it could go back decades that the state was actually in a negative cash position throughout the year, outlaying cash before revenues are collected. That has since changed. As Secretary Hicks talked about, kind of those large increases in the budget reserve trust fund drove some of this. Federal money drove some of this. So I'm not really good with colors, but the greenish, yellowish at the bottom. We start in 2021 to see a drastic change. We obviously have that dip and outlay of cash that we see kind of throughout the year, but it's offset by those surpluses and additional federal money. So we see a climb. So maybe about May of 2021 is where the general fund short-term pool actually has a positive balance. And then that continues as additional budget surpluses. So the debt side of OFM absolutely loves this. Liquidity is basically substantially improved. Our credit ratings, as a result of that, are affected with a lot less liquidity, and we're not running a negative cash balance. And we don't have to do the other things a lot of other states do. Those cash balances that they're negative, most states run a deficit and they have to issue debt to basically pay the bills throughout the year. We don't have to do that. We don't have to do that anymore. And we used to interfund borrow. We don't have to interfund borrow. General fund doesn't have to interfund borrow from other agencies. So that has drastically changed, with that improvement in liquidity. So commensurate with that, yes, sir. It would be in the average. So we're basically saying fiscal year 20 before is represented by that bottom line. We were running in negative cash flow positions throughout the year.
As FY 20.
20 was kind of the transition. We left that off. The line is supposed to represent like the historical norm.
Can you get the 20 to us also? Just get it back to the committee just so we can see it.
Certainly.
I just got to have them lined out in my brain.
Okay. We didn't want to make it too busy, so we'll give you both a table and we'll get that to you. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, really, two things have changed. Historically, the general fund didn't have any cash. The general fund has cash now. And for recent history, the last decade, particularly in the last couple of years, rates have been at zero. So, there was modest earnings, even with low and negative cash balances historically, there was modest earnings. And there has been basically negative earnings because the general fund would be in a negative cash flow position, have to borrow from other funds and pay a repo rate. So, instead of borrowing, it was a cheaper option than borrowing like Illinois and other states do. They'll issue trans or rands. It was a cheaper option to interfund borrow. So that policy decision was made a number of years ago to interfund borrow. Fast forward to larger cash balances, higher interest rates. The general fund had a great year in 2023. It was over $150 million that was generated in interest earnings. And kind of partly how that happened. Yes, sir.
50 mil. In the budget reserve trust fund. Just want to make sure we don't get that confused with what the ending balance was after the money was dumped in at the end of the fiscal year. This is on 2.2 or 2.3 billion that was maintained in the trust fund. It's where the 150 investment income comes from.
Well, it would be that plus the additional money in the short-term part. There's
But
various.
that would be relatively.
Yes. So again, focused on higher balances, higher rates produced the earnings, and we've actually just recently posted the first month of just recently posted this month, and we're seeing that continue into the fiscal year. So, kind of in terms of what was handled, predominantly, really the second two bullet points is where the short-term pool was invested. With the uncertainty around COVID. Various budgets could have large appropriations, and the ever increasing and forward projection of rates, the short-term pool was basically kept in a money market and repurchase agreements. Just this January, given the larger balances, some rate stabilization. I want to be clear, we are not in the business of projecting interest rates. If somebody tells you they are and they're not on a beach, living off of earnings, they're lying to you. So we are not in that industry. However, we felt there was some certainty around it, and given the large cash balances, we have implemented a Treasury and agency cash match. So historically, we know when needs were for the state. The budget office, controller office does a good job of anticipated future needs. So we basically have treasuries and agencies matched to future cash needs, and we've created a longer duration and been able to pick up some additional yields. But again, this is all within statute and regulatory guidance. This is fixed income and securities that don't move substantially with interest rate changes because, as I said before, we are not in the position to tell the General Assembly through an appropriation that a security is invested long term and you can't have that money for a duration, or we got to sell it at a loss. So that is a key tenet of how we invest those proceeds. But we have increased systematically and laddered out securities since this January. That is producing additional yield, and we will see that in monthly and fiscal year reporting.
Yeah, and just to add on, we would watch these monthly interest incomes during this past fiscal year, and we would call him, and say, all right, explain that for us. We wanted to understand because we've never seen this before, right? A high budget reserve trust fund balance and then short-term rates having risen. This is good fortune, for the general fund. And as Ryan said in KRS 42500 Section 12, the interest income earned on general fund balances, including the budget reserve, goes to the general fund. Interest income earned on road fund balances goes to the road fund. One of the other things that he mentioned, you see those negatives you see in a handful of years, that's because of the method of accounting that the Governmental Accounting Standards Board requires from us. So we do what they call mark to market on a monthly basis. So we could buy a bond and we know we're going to get that bond principal back down the road. We know we're going to get the interest earning on it, but in July, that bond may not be worth as much as it was when we bought it, even though we're guaranteed. And so we've got to account for that lower value. And so there's predictability issues, and these are very predictable. But that's why you can see some negatives there, not only because we had negative cash balances, but sometimes in a monthly basis until we mature to an instrument. We have to see negatives. The reason I bring this up is another example he mentioned is the Capital Construction Investment Income Pool. That is a source of funds that's statutory. It's been around. It gets the interest income on all the funds that don't already have a dedicated interest income. Like most of the funds that are created in statute, you will write in your drafting, they'll get their own interest income. But there are funds out there that don't. And the Capital Construction Investment Income account receives the benefit of that. So Ryan and his staff take those a little bit longer out because the liquidity issues are not the same as the general fund and the road fund. And so I'll give you an example. In fiscal year 22, we were negative 40 million in that account. When we do the budget, when you all do the budget, we look at that account to fund maintenance pools, basically, right? And so in the budget we are sitting in fiscal 23, we had $0 budgeted in maintenance pools from that source in fiscal 23 because of what happened in fiscal 22. We do have funds appropriated in fiscal 24, and last year, fiscal 23, we gained around, I think it was about $40 million positive. So predictability is also an issue when you're deciding how to invest and what the source of funds you're investing. So it's a little bit of issue. And one of the things we're working on right now, my staff that been working with LRC staff, is getting ready to forecast revenues for the next budget. Well, we're paying close attention to this item, investment income. We do have to somewhat predict interest rates when we're trying to estimate, 30 months out. But this is something that we've got, zeroed in on in working with the Office of Financial Management as we look to the next consensus forecasting group meeting.
Next slide, please. Last slide. So I'm going to tell you, Ryan in particular, thank you. We spoke a year or two ago, I can't remember, year and a half ago, and we talked about this, and there was no investment returns. And at that time, we went through statutes and what was available, what wasn't, and you were great to work with. And I think back then, I assured you in that conversation that Senator McDaniel and I both were committed to making sure that there was a healthy reserve that would be there. And so that money can be used for longer term investments so you can avoid your liquidity issues with rolling debts and rolling issuances and those type things. And what you're doing, you said it would take a little bit of time. It did, but when we started seeing the investment revenue coming in the monthly reports, I'm like, Ryan has got this thing going now, and I'm so tickled to see it. So I want to tell you thank you. It's doing as well or better than what we had hoped. And right now, you know it better than I do. You can seize on some very safe returns on your investments at a higher rate than you could have gotten in the last 2 or 3 or 4 or 15 years also. There's a unique opportunity to get real investment income off of this. So thank you very much for following up on that.
Well, thank you.
We have Senator Boswell.
Yes, thank you. My question is similar to what Mr. Petrie just asked. So
So that is some of what I touched on in the kind of investment manual, as well as some policy and procedures of our office. So it really depends on, as long as you're within statute and reg in terms of what you can invest in. We have live trading, so we use Bloomberg Compliance Manager. So there's very, when you see a movie, you see those machines in the background. Well, we have a couple of those. They don't look as nice. But we basically have a system where we will put out to various entities, depending on the type of security, if it's an asset-backed, mortgage-backed, treasury. And then we have a list of approved broker-dealers that's based on statute and capital requirements. So if you once a year you can get on the list, and then we will put that out, and they'll have a live bid. Now this is not like a state procurement. This happens within seconds, or sometimes we'll seek a security, and we have a live bid for those securities, and then we'll settle per the terms. Yep.
On investments, does that go to the general fund or does it stay within the budget reserve fund?
It goes to the general fund because the budget reserve trust fund is actually a component of the general fund.
Okay.
So it's not assigned to the budget reserve trust fund, it's assigned to the general fund.
Thank you.
Needs of Kentucky. We possibly have Brian up. And again, just to remind you, the wireless microphone is what you will want to use. The wired mics are just not consistent today. If each of you will introduce yourselves for the record, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Byans, a partner at Government Strategies, and I am representing Kentuckians for Better Transportation.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Wright. I'm the president of the Owensboro Riverport Authority, as well as the chair of Kentucky Association of Riverports.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Kirchner. I'm the executive director of Kentuckians for Better Transportation.
Very good. If each of you will raise your right hands, please. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please proceed.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to have a discussion on the public riverport industry in Kentucky. I know we are limited on the amount of time that we have, so we're going to jump right in. Brian will begin our presentation by providing some background and history on riverports, public riverports in Kentucky generally. I think that may be helpful as we have this conversation this afternoon. And then Jennifer will talk about state funding levels, the levels at which our surrounding states fund public ports, and some of the challenges here in Kentucky with public ports. So with that, and then I'll add that I will conclude by talking about a few ideas and solutions that we hope you all might be willing to consider in the 2024 legislative session. So with that, we'll get started.
Realize no asks are allowed today, but we can move forward. That's fine.
Okay.
To start with, looking at public authorities across the state of Kentucky, all of the public authorities related to the Riverport fall under legislative law, Kentucky law, the KRS statute 65510. In that statute, it requires any local governments, entities across the state of Kentucky can establish a port authority, and it can be operated and managed through that local government, whether it's mayor and county, mayor only, city only, and or county only. So in our example in Owensboro, we are chartered by the city of Owensboro. If you go to Henderson, it's chartered by the county. And then in some cases, you can also have a split board between city and county. Across the state of Kentucky, we actually have 10 riverport authorities that reside across most of our river systems. Of those, 7 are active, and the way we defined active is they're actually the 7 ports that are moving goods in and out today. The 3 developing are authorities in place that have been granted through the Transportation Cabinet, but are not currently moving goods in and out. If you look at the map across the state of Kentucky, as I mentioned, we cover all the waterways, starting with the furthest western port authority, Hickman, Fulton, which resides on the Mississippi, and then on up the river. Western Kentucky Regional River Port Authority is a developing port. And then moving on to Paducah, McCracken, Eddyville, which falls on Lake Barkley, Henderson, Owensboro, Louisville. Northern Kentucky is a developing port, as well as Maysville Mason is also a developing port, and then Far Eastern on the Big Sandy, which is Greenup Boyd. So when you think about the ports across the state and the amount of waterways that the state of Kentucky is fortunate enough to have, we look at our public authorities as anchor ports for the entire state. There are several private ports throughout the state, 100 plus at a minimum, that typically focus on single commodity type activities, either single commodity or one or two commodities in general. However, if you look at this map displayed here and think about our public authorities and the reach and range that each of these ports have for not only our state but extended states as well. The green counties represent what's within 90 minutes and the blue is what's within 90 miles. When you're looking at moving heavy cargo goods, you obviously want to move them within the shortest distance between A and B. However, if you're utilizing the river system for large bulk type commodities, you still have to get it to that furthest county, in our particular case in Owensboro, which could be Warren County. So what value does this bring to the state of Kentucky? The information shared here now goes back to 2018 as part of our freight and rail study that was conducted through the cabinet. The state of Kentucky had almost 90 million tons of freight that used our inland waterway system in 2018, which represented $18 billion in value as far as goods traded. Of those trades, almost 80% of those were with trading partners outside of the state of Kentucky, which could be international or other states. Looking at what benefit that provides for the full multimodal aspect of the state of Kentucky, starting with environmental first, from an environmental perspective, barge versus rail versus truck is the most efficient as far as impact to the environment per ton mile traveled. Barge is first, rail is second, and then truck. The second key benefit for the state of Kentucky is the impacts that this 89 million tons on the inland river system have for our interstates and rural highways and city streets as well. If you look at across the 89 million tons moved, that represents 2.3 billion vehicles miles traveled that was saved by actually having our inland river system as part of our multimodal economy in the state of Kentucky, as well as 43 million vehicle hours of travel saved from ground transportation by utilizing the inland river system. The supply chain overall has a huge impact on the type of commodities. Energy, chemicals, fuels, agriculture is a key commodity that's used on the inland river system, as well as metals and other minerals that supply major manufacturing throughout the state of Kentucky.
Let's talk a little bit about how we currently invest in our river ports in Kentucky. Since 2013, the Commonwealth has supported the Riverport industry through the Kentucky Riverport Improvement Grant Program. This program is currently allocated $500,000 annually. Those funds come from the general fund and are given to the Transportation Cabinet and in their budget. Currently, this program requires a 50% match, and the applications each year are due in May for the July 1 fiscal year. Those funds must then be spent by June 30th, or they get returned to the general fund, and there is no carryover. Funding can be used for new construction, repairs, replacement docks. I'll let you read all of the things that we can invest in, but I will make a special note that the funds are not used to be used on routine maintenance, port operations plans, or studies. So if we take a little bit of a look around at our surrounding states, as you can tell from the hinterlands, our economies are linked. Kentucky is, of our 10 river ports, as I mentioned, we're funding at $500,000 a year. Our neighbors to the north in Ohio, they have 8 ports, 20 million is what they're funding their ports, and a recent $12 million increased investment. Missouri is similar to Ohio in their funding, and they allocated an additional $30 million in 23 from ARPA funds. Illinois is taking top spot with $150 million in funding for the river ports. I will note also that $40 million of that is specifically for a port authority in Cairo, which will be in direct competition with all of our Western Kentucky ports, specifically with Paducah. So just to be clear about some of the challenges we're facing, yes. Yes. Say it one more time.
What is that?
Oh, in Indiana and Tennessee, they don't currently have state grant programs
And they haven't within the last few years, or is just something they've recently ceased?
within the last few years.
All right, thank you.
Inadequate funding is a challenge for Riverport. $12.3 million for preservation asset was determined in the 2018 study that we've been referencing. Increased annual state funding is needed to continue investment and to compete with surrounding states. Currently, we can't realize our full growth potential because we're trying to keep operations running every day. Treading water would be a good pun to use, I suppose. River ports are unable to use these state grant funds to make federal matches. The timing restraints on how the KRI is set up does not make it useful in pulling down those federal funds. And as I mentioned, the funds do not carry over, and that currently it's a 50% local match, which is oftentimes hard for the ports to manage. Yes.
Amount or a cap on how much can be pulled down in a year, or how much is available from the feds in a given year? So if you had unlimited match, you can have unlimited funds, or is there some kind of ceiling to that?
I think each year is a little bit different. For an example, in the Marine Highway Program that was just issued this past year, it was $25 million versus prior years, which was only $5 million. And then there's a Port Development Infrastructure Fund that's also available, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's pretty extensive that they released this past year.
Okay, so following up on several of the challenges that Jennifer referred to in the previous slide, we do have several ideas on solutions that we would like for the General Assembly to consider in the upcoming session. As we've mentioned, there was a KYTC study that was released last year that did identify $12.3 million in asset preservation needs among the 10 public river ports. These are needs specific to infrastructure, facility, and equipment needs that simply just put the ports at a level where they need to be. I mean, we're simply talking about keeping them at status quo and maintaining their current level of service. This is based on, and Brian referenced this earlier, data from 2018. So considering what we've seen in inflation, a solution that we have is looking at a one-time $15 million allocation that would be accessible to all 10 ports. And the ports are currently putting together lists of what these projects would include, and several of them have already completed their list. I want to be very upfront with you all that you will not look at these lists and think, wow, these are some big and bold ideas. We want to get to a point where we can be thinking big and bold, but at this point there are some urgent needs related again to asset preservation and just keeping the ports being able to operate at the levels that they need to.
Let me get a little clarification.
Yes,
Asset
sir.
preservation, but that includes all 10 ports, 3 of which are.
So that's a great question, and we have talked to the Transportation Cabinet about that. When the study was put together and released last year, the Cabinet did approach all 10 ports, so the 7 active, the 3 developing, asking about needs, and the 3 developing ports were included in those conversations, and some of their needs were encompassed in that $12.3 million. That's my understanding, yes, sir. So also want to mention that as we've looked at the projects that would be included in this $15 million allocation, we do feel pretty confident that most, if not all, of those projects could be completed in the 2-year budget period. So wanted to make note of that. And we would also request that there be no local match required for the $15 million one-time allocation. Looking at the second solution or the second bullet point in terms of what we would like to see in the upcoming session, we want to get to a point where we are not sitting here every 2, 4, 6 years asking for assistance with asset preservation. And so in an effort to address that, we would like to look at increased sustainable annual funding. As we mentioned, current annual funding is at $500,000 per year. We completely understand the challenges that come with asking for more ongoing funding. And so we have put a lot of thought and time into looking at a dedicated revenue source and what that might look like. We do want to be very careful. It's very important that we don't create a new structure or establish new fees that could create unintended consequences for our customer base. So with that in mind, we have looked at existing revenue sources that may be an option, and we've identified the commercial watercraft property tax. And I want to emphasize that we are only talking about the state general fund portion of this tax. We are not talking about the local government portion, no funds that would go to the local governments from this property tax. In 2021, it's our understanding that the state general fund received just shy of $5 million from these tax dollars, and we think that it makes a lot of sense to reinvest the tax dollars in the facilities that help generate the funding. And ideally, as the ports are able to access the funding, they're able to continue to improve their operations, their facilities, which will drive new business, new investment, and we can see that funding source increase, which we think is certainly a win-win for all involved. And then finally, the third suggestion that we have is to look at, and this is also a suggestion that I think provides some long-term benefit, but we would like to look at how the annual funding is currently administered or allocated. Jennifer mentioned that the $500,000 goes through the Kentucky Riverport Improvement Program. This is a program that's administered through the Transportation Cabinet. They do a really good job in administering it, but there are a few programmatic changes that are not, or programmatic parts of it that are not ideal for our river ports. And so we would suggest looking at utilizing the Riverport Financial Assistance Trust Fund. This is a trust fund that the General Assembly created in statute in 2010. It, to our knowledge, has never been utilized. There's never been any funds appropriated to it. But there are two main reasons, two main benefits that we see to using the trust fund versus the KRI grant program. The first point addresses an issue Jennifer mentioned, which is it would allow funding to carry forward. Currently, any funds remaining at the end of the fiscal year lapse back to the general fund. And then the second item is that the trust fund would allow for a decrease in the local match. Included in that statute is an 80-20 match, so 20% local match, which would be I think better for the ports, particularly the smaller ports, than the 50% match, which is required currently. And the best example that we can give on that is that in this most recent fiscal year, there were two public ports that were unable to participate or chose not to participate in the state program because they had outstanding federal grant applications in, and they were saving their local money to in hopes that those grants would be awarded, and they would need a local match there. So by reducing the local match requirement, we think that it would certainly benefit the ports in Kentucky. And then as we conclude, I just want to mention two items. There are two programs that you all have passed in the past couple of years that the Riverports have opportunities to participate in. The Kentucky Product Development Initiative is a program that several of the Riverports are able to access through that grant program. Very appreciative of that. And then also, most recently, you all passed House Bill 9, which we see great opportunity to use that as a mechanism to help meet federal match requirements for those Riverports in the enhanced counties. So I'll just end by saying that those two programs, I think, are great complements to what we're talking about here today, which is really a targeted and we think sensible approach to helping to fund public Riverports and their needs. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope we stayed within our allotted time, and we'll take questions.
Of income that you had during the time that the Mississippi River was down and you couldn't export?
I can't speak to the furthest western states because they were hit probably the hardest. Fortunately for us, once you get past the Olmsted Lock and Dam, we sustained the pull. The Army Corps was able to dredge enough to pass those barges. So for a short period of time, we saw essentially all the barges stop in place in Cairo until the Army Corps of Engineers were able to come in and dredge out, and they continue to move. The biggest impact on the Mississippi going down that direction was the fact that you couldn't even access the docks because of the drought. Unfortunately, I don't know how specifically for Hickman and some of those other ports on what the financial impact was for them. I think the timing of it was a little post-harvest, which helped, but I'm sure they saw some impacts.
Very good. It is 2:22. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question, very brief comment. You mentioned the Riverports can't use state funds to match federal funds. Is that because we tell you you can, or is that a federal issue?
The biggest limitation with the state funds through the KRI program is when you apply for federal dollars, it generally takes multiple years as far as the initial application, securing the funds for the potential match, and then the process for approval. On the KRI funds, we are required to have those dollars spent within the fiscal year, July to June. So we have to be very strategic about what type of application that we can put those towards. For an example, asset preservation could be equipment only versus a bigger project. A good example of that would be in Hickman, their primary 75% of their volume is dependent on a grain conveyor that was built in the 70s. They are looking to replace that system at $4.5 million. They went after a PDIP grant at the federal level, and therefore held off on the KRI, one, because they needed enough local match of the $4.5 million at 20% at least. Plus, they will tell you that that particular project could take 2 to 3 years, especially when you get federal dollars and you have to plan and pre-plan on the front side.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I just very briefly, I just want to point out that we do have some funding that we're going to have to work to decide what we're going to do with. We have a pretty good fund to work with at this point. The temptation might be to create new programs that we'll have to fund for years and years afterwards, or we can look at what we can do with the funds we have in hand, one-time shot in the arm for programs or for projects like what you're talking about. And I'm very supportive of the fact that we can come together and do a one-time shot in the arm is the term I like to use, help you guys out, help many of the other infrastructure programs that we have. So I'm very much going to be focused on infrastructure, and particularly being from Owensboro, I'm excited about the Riverport options as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your time.
Very good. Just to reiterate, when you look at reserve funds, those are one time. Don't think about using those for recurring expenses, not good business. Representative Bowling. Very good. Thank you very much. Senator Bos.
Nature of our Riverport. 10, we have 10 public ports, but you didn't mention how many are private. How many private ports do we have?
Across the entire state, there's well over 100.
Okay, so the private ports don't receive any. There's no anything involving private ports. So we're only talking about public. So of the public ports, are some of those? Is there a percentage of those, or do you have a number of those who may be losing?
I can't speak to all the ports, but in general, they are breaking even, just trying to keep their assets in order to generate day-to-day business and to sustain what they have. The biggest challenges, especially for some of the smaller ports across the state, is maintaining what they have with no opportunity to grow for the future.
Thank you for all the work that you do in Owensboro. You do a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Bentley, it's 226.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is to anyone, we people in eastern Kentucky know those dams are not for flooding.
In the western part of the state, between the Olmsted Lock and Dam and up in the Hallsville area, the Corps tries to maintain a minimum normal pull, which allows for barge drafting, normal barge drafting. However, the barge drafting is really dictated by where the goods are ultimately going or coming from. So if the Mississippi is down, just an example, this past week they issued a restriction down on the Mississippi. They reduced the draft to 9 to 8 feet compared to 9.5 or 10, and that will apply all the way up to Greenup Boyd, for an example, or all the way down. So they look at the entire navigational system. The Mississippi generally is the one that dictates the draft during the peak of the summer pull.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. One Riverports are connected to rail.
It's an excellent question, and I'm trying to calculate it in my head as we sit here, but I'm almost certain that all the active ports have a connection to a rail line. Specifically in Hickman, they have an outdated rail system that feeds into their port, so they're a little apprehensive or looking for future infrastructure. And then on up the river, Paducah has direct rail. Eddyville has rail within the vicinity, fairly close, if not on it. Henderson, I know. Owensboro, definitely. Louisville they manage over 13 miles of rail. And then I'm uncertain about Greenup Boyd.
And we have
Good afternoon. My name is William Downey. I'm with R.J. Corman Railroad Group here today representing the Kentucky Rail Association. I do. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for having us today. Our presentation will follow a similar pattern as the Riverports did as we talk about our network, some funding mechanisms and programs, some investment in the state, and then potential needs and next steps. So I'm here today representing the Kentucky Rail Association. That consists of the 4 rail carriers you see on your screen. There are 15 railroads in the state. However, these are the 4 primary rail carriers. In your packets, you have information a little bit more in depth about each company, so I won't go too much, but CSX is the largest rail carrier throughout the state. They have over 2,000 miles. Norfolk Southern is another Class 1 provider. They have a little over 500 miles in the state. And then Paducah and Louisville is a regional railroad consisting from, as the name implies, Paducah to Louisville. And then R.J. Corman, we have multiple rail lines as a short line throughout the state. When I say Class 1 railroads and short lines, Class 1 railroads are more, think, a large amount of freight hauling long distances. So think I-75, I-64. When I say short lines, we are more your city streets, county roads, in the case of Paducah and Louisville, maybe even the Western Kentucky Parkway. So the rail network is a very interconnected network. We have a very hand-in-glove relationship between the railroads. So when I say a short line, we are essentially your first mile and last mile designation for customers oftentimes. So we meet our Class 1 partners at a designated interchange. We will bring in freight from them and then deliver that to an industry along our line. And we will also take that product and bring it back to a designated interchange point to CSX or Norfolk Southern, and they will then take it to market either throughout the state or throughout the nationwide transportation network on to Chicago or down to New Orleans, wherever that may be. So here's some information on carload data in Kentucky, and this is 2021 figures. So you'll see the total carloads that originated here in Kentucky are 366,400 carloads. So the Texas Transportation Institute has a conservative calculation of 2.87 trucks per carload. So if you look at the carloads that originated in Kentucky, that would be the equivalent of 1,051,568 trucks on our overcrowded and underfunded roadways. So you see the impact the freight network has here in Kentucky that our rail provides for the movement of freight throughout our state. So a little bit about investment here in Kentucky from the railroads. An industry average for the rail industry is and this is pertinent here in Kentucky just as it is nationwide. Railroads typically invest about 25% of their revenues on average back into their network every single year. So if you look at just the 4 railroads represented here, and I mentioned there are 15 total in the state, so this number is higher, but you look at about $160 million in investment back into the rail network, which includes maintenance, rehabilitation, as well as capital expenditures here just in Kentucky alone. So we've had some recent public and private investment partnerships that I did want to highlight for you all as it relates to federal dollars coming to Kentucky being invested into the rail infrastructure. First was a infra grant award to the Paducah and Louisville Railway. It was actually applied for by the Green River Area Development District. It was to upgrade the Rockport Bridge that transports Paducah and Louisville's railroad and connects Ohio and Muhlenberg counties. Paducah and Louisville invested close to $21 million as part of this project, and they were awarded over $17 million. So $38 million total coming back to Kentucky to invest in rail infrastructure on a line that carries over 112,000 carloads. The legislature, in your all's wisdom and foresight and partnership, allocated $100,000 towards this grant. Now, I know that number does not seem very big. However, nothing shows support to the federal government. A letter is great and it's nice, but nothing shows support to help these projects like money. And so when you invested and decided to partner with the Area Development District along with the Paducah Railway investment, it made this project that much more enticing. So if you look at it as you invested or leveraged $100,000 and it created a $38 million investment in rail infrastructure in Western Kentucky. We were successful just over a year ago on a Chrissy grant that was over $7.8 million or $7.3 million. We invested another $6 million ourselves in additional expenses coming to the Central Kentucky area that will be put to work coming soon. We also, Chairman Petrie, are waiting on a $30 million grant in conjunction with Logan Aluminum in your district that will, in partnership with them, really expand their presence and the rail line in Western Kentucky that we operate from Bowling Green to Clarksville. So those are the type of dollars that your railroads are going after to help bring those federal funds back to Kentucky to strengthen the safety and efficiency of our operations here in the Commonwealth. So we look at the program currently in Kentucky, and we have the Kentucky Rail Crossing Improvement Program, commonly known as the KRCI. Typically, we are allocated about $1.6 million, and these funds are limited to grade crossing repairs and improvements. We work with the Transportation Cabinet, and in recent years, we've been able to expand that slightly to attack a few more safety issues along crossings to make those funds available for vegetation mitigation, as an example. And that typically is a 50-50 program. It's gone to 80-20, so we've been very appreciative of that. This last round, the railroad industry decided that it was time, with the cabinet was updating the state rail plan that had not been updated since 2015. So we thought it was a good idea that in addition to updating the rail plan, that we would invest $350,000 out of these funds to go towards a more in-depth needs assessment study of the overall rail network, which is undergoing and just began, looking at the overall health of the rail network, needs assessment from track and ties and bridges, looking at choke points on the network, things like that. Just pretty much a very similar type of study that was done by the Riverports. We're hoping to have that completed in the next 12 to 18 months. So here, these are a few of our state leaders and funding programs when it comes to railroads. Several are adjacent states: Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Virginia, also North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. I make reference to as kind of model programs. From like you all, I don't like losing to Tennessee, North Carolina, those folks on the basketball court or football field, much less having our state, be behind from an infrastructure investment standpoint. So one of the programs I wanted to highlight is just across the river in Indiana. In 2017, and I believe this was included in your packet as well, but they created a local tracks over program where they appropriated $125 million that they work with local communities and the railroads to identify crossings along the rail network, but they work together to consolidate crossings and create overpasses that also creates crossing eliminations for these communities. And to date, they've had projects range from $7 million to $15 million, and they've had over 32 crossings closed, and that's a 80-20 type match program. They also have the Industrial Rail Service Fund, which is they take a very, very small percentage of the sales tax, which results in about $3.5 to $4 million annually that short-line railroads are able to access for preservation and maintenance and industrial and economic development projects. So other state funding programs I've highlighted in Tennessee. 2 years ago, the General Assembly and the governor budgeted for $85 million in new rail preservation funding. So that $85 million is spread over 4 years to the various short-line railroads throughout the state of Tennessee. It is a 90-10 match. So they have a preservation fund because they are focused on preserving the short line and rail connectivity in their rural districts throughout the state. They also have a long-term goal, which is more significant investment, of making all short lines 286 compliant. And when I say that, 286 refers to the amount of tonnage or the amount of pounds that rail cars can carry. So a rail car can carry up to 286,000 pounds, which is typically what our Class 1 railroads carry. A lot of short line railroads, especially in Tennessee or more rural parts, had either at one time maybe been abandoned or are just aging, had significant age and have not been upgraded over the years. So they are unable to handle that same capacity. So the long-term goal is to actually upgrade all of the short lines throughout the state to carry 286 so that you can have that seamless interconnectivity between Class 1s and short lines, and you can ultimately carry and move more freight. Pennsylvania, you can see there they have two types of programs: the Rail Freight Assistance Program, the Rail Transportation Assistance Program. Since 2016, they've had over 189 projects, averaging $1.2 million per award. That's a 70-30, 70 from the state, 30% match from the railroads throughout the state, totaling over $226 million from the state of Pennsylvania. North Carolina, their funding programs since 2014 have generated over $263 million in investment, over $131 million coming from the state of North Carolina. They offer a 50-50 match program, railroad safety, crossing improvements, mainline, branch lines, tire replacement, all of that going towards the rail network in the state of North Carolina. So I mentioned the current rail assessment study. Again, that is underway. We felt as a rail network, as a rail association, it was very important to take a deeper dive into the health of the rail network. As I mentioned, looking at bridges, looking at main lines, looking at corridors, pinch points, choke points on the network. What is the overall health? What are our outstanding maintenance needs? Where do we see future capital investment to help spur economic and industrial development? So that is currently underway. We're working very closely with the cabinet along with HDR Engineering, who is leading that study. So a couple ideas of programs, and these are just names I came up with for the sake of conversation, that we could look at in Kentucky if there were to be a funding mechanism created for the rail industry. So the Kentucky Freight Investment Program, looking at preservation and maintenance, industrial access, spurring economic development, and then a Kentucky Federal Freight Fund. So I mentioned those grants that are available that we are currently going after. If we had any type of funding that could support the rail industry and going after those federal funds, as there is a lot of money through the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act right now to take advantage of those projects and bring additional rail funding back to Kentucky to improve the health of the network. So, and otherwise, I'm open for questions.
Very good. Well, the benefit of going last. Committee as a council. One, thank you very much, and I hope the opportunities are good wherever you're going to. Thank you. And otherwise, Co-Chairman, you got anything? All right, well then we'll be ready for the next.